All right, so last but certainly not least, we focus on the American news media. Now, you may wonder, and it's a reasonable thing to wonder, why the American news media or news in general would fall in a class on American government. And, well, it falls in with these linkage institutions that we've been talking about now for, weeks at this point. The news media is one of the things, for good or for ill, that connects us to governance by informing us about the government. So it fits in this class the same way that interest groups do, because some people are connected to politics and to governing through the interest groups that they choose to belong to, or in the way that political parties connect us to politics by giving us a source of identification within the larger realm of the political community. The American news media functions very similarly. So we're going to look at the American news media from two different perspectives. The first perspective we're going to look at, and we're probably going to spend, to be honest with you, a bit more time on, is going to be looking at the roles of the American news media, how the American news media actually goes about their job as it relates to governing, the roles that they play in making us more aware, if you will, and some would argue less aware, of what our government is doing. If you're wondering about the nuance of that, I'll explain in a moment. Then we'll close by probably what is the most discussed part of the news media as it relates to government, which is the subject of bias. So we'll get to that in a moment. But first, we want to talk about roles. So the roles of the news media are threefold. So as it relates to American politics, they play these three roles. And in the execution of these three roles, we can see how the news media can shape our politics. George Lakoff, who is a political scientist, has written an entire book about the concept of framing. It's called Don't Think of an Elephant. The idea being, of course, that it's the old cliche that if you want someone to think of an elephant, the first thing you do is tell them, don't think of an elephant. So, framing is a way in which news events can be portrayed, and portrayed in a way that lead us to particular conclusions. That is, all three of these things you're going to see here, the gatekeeper, scorekeeper, and watchdog role, can help in framing the information about politics in a way that either changes our perspective on those politics or, more often than not, reinforces them. So we'll look at these individually. The gatekeeper role, the scorekeeper role, and the watchdog role. Those are the three roles. So let's look at these individually. So the first role is a role known as the gatekeeper role. Now, the gatekeeper role is based on a very simple premise. And that simple premise is that in any news media outlet, and I've worked in two, I worked in television very briefly, and I worked for an internet site. You only have so much space. Now, space can be construed in a bunch of different ways, right? Television space is minutes. You have a 1 hour news broadcast. You really don't have a 1 hour news broadcast. You have a 40-minute news broadcast because you have commercials. And you have set segments that are in every broadcast that aren't going to get moved or changed or cut altogether unless there's a massive news event, a big earthquake, an attempted assassination of a presidential candidate, things like that. In those cases, you're just going to stick with that the entire time. But in a typical day, then you're going to have 40 minutes, like I said. You're going to take probably 10 out, or in that area, for sports, which is what I actually worked in, weather. Usually there's some rotating segment. Ours was between like a fashion segment, which I'll confess I never actually watched. We had a guy called the Cyber Guy who was introducing people to this amazing new thing called the internet. This was 30 years ago. Over 30 years ago, tragically. Whatever. So by the time you get those three set segments out of the way, and we always did some sort of fun story at the end. I used to call it the water skiing squirrel segment. Something that people would leave a little lighter mood. You know, you don't want to leave something heavy and sad on the news. So once you put all those set segments in, now you're down to 20 minutes or so, maybe 25. They always open with it's local news in this case because it was Channel 5. So they'd have local news stories that might cover 10 minutes of that time, maybe more, depending on what's going on here around LA. So by the time it's all said and done, for national political news, they may only have a few minutes. What are you putting in? What are you leaving out? The website that I write for, or wrote for, I should say, past tense. I'm in between gigs at the moment. We do 16 stories a day that go on the front of the website. They do other stories that may be elsewhere in the website that you could dig for and look. But in terms of what you would call our front page, to use a newspaper analogy, 16 stories in a day. We rotate them every 45 minutes for 12 hours, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Because you're not going to run news stories when nobody's reading them, right? You're not putting new content up at 2:45 in the morning for people not to read because everybody's asleep, right? So, 16 stories a day. And if it's a big enough news event, you're going to do more than one story on it. So at the end of the day, what are you leaving in? What are you taking out? That is the gatekeeper role. And a lot can happen with that gatekeeper role. It's what Lakoff and others have called agenda setting. So if I focus on a particular news event, like, let's just be topical here in the summer of 2024, which is when I'm recording this, a not particularly good debate performance. If you focus on that for a week or more on end, actually at this point, again, recording this in the summer until mid-July, we're up on 3 weeks now. Obviously, what you're telling your listeners, your readers, your viewers is this thing's really important. This is something you should be focusing on. So that's part of the gatekeeper role. Likewise, if you don't cover something at all, or you cover it very briefly, you're telling your viewers, your readers, and this isn't that important. We just wanted to make sure you knew about it, but we are showing you by the fact we only devoted 22 seconds to it on our news broadcast that it's something we feel like we need to tell you, but it's not that big a deal. Whereas if we open with it on our news broadcast and we spend 6.5 minutes on it and we have live interviews with 3 different people, we're telling you this is super important. So the gatekeeper role is a signaling process. It's like, okay, here we are. We're leading with this news story. If it's a website, we've covered this topic 4 different times today. We're telling you it's really important. And that is where some bias can sneak in, and we'll get to that a little later. The scorekeeper role, which admittedly in my media career, my adult media career, not counting when I was doing sports at Channel 5 30 years ago, but the one I've been in the last 15 years, most of my work has been in the scorekeeper role. A lot of electoral analysis, a lot of polling analysis. Scorekeeper role is using data to determine in politics who's winning and who's losing, who has an advantage, who has a disadvantage, okay? One of the things that's built out of that gatekeeper role dealing with the 2024 presidential debate, the initial one in June, is that every major media outlet immediately then went to polling. Now, the interesting thing is, if you are a scorekeeper type, you can make the story whatever you want it to be. For example, if I'm a Biden supporter, I point out the fact that the presidential, what we call general election trial heat polls, that is to say, who you're going to vote for, have scarcely changed at all. Maybe at most 2 points, and in some cases less than that. If you're someone who's not a fan of Joe Biden, then you might focus on the fact that if you ask people, is Joe Biden too old to be president? You get a pretty strong majority that says that. Or do you have fears that he's not up to the job? You get pretty strong numbers for that. So you can choose, using the data you choose to employ, what matters and what doesn't. So this is more of an analytical and an assessment role. And again, very prone to bias because it's very simply built off of whatever data you choose to use. Is this going to be a good year or a bad year for the Democrats? Well, depending on which perspective I want to give you, there's ample data to suggest that I'm right, by God. If you want to say Trump's going to win, you could look at individual state data, or if you want to say that Biden's going to win, you could look at election data from 2023, where the Democrats retook the Virginia state legislature, or a Democrat was reelected in the very red state of Kentucky for governor and almost won the very red state of Mississippi for governor. So there's data either way that supports your perspective, and what you choose to put out there will speak to how you set the agenda. And then last but absolutely not least is the watchdog role. Now, the watchdog role is why we have a First Amendment. It's why the framers put into the Constitution the guarantee of a free press. The watchdog role is the accountability portion of our media. Good watchdog journalism, and I'll be the first to say not all of it's good, is investigative in nature, and it's predicated on the idea of holding political leaders accountable. This is when the press are our eyes and ears, watching the actions of our government and reporting back to us on what is being done, for good or for ill. That is the role known as the watchdog role. So the performance of the media in unveiling and promoting the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War would be a classic example of watchdog journalism. The Washington Post helping unravel the Watergate scandal would be an example of watchdog journalism. The press covering the January 6th riot at the Capitol in 2021 is watchdog journalism. Investigating President Biden's business ties, or the business ties of his family, more appropriately, his brother and his son. Those would be watchdog roles as well. Now, again, there can be agenda setting in the watchdog role. You can be a selective watchdog, right? If you're Fox News and you know that you cater to a very conservative viewership, you probably are not going to... I didn't watch it because I will reveal I don't regularly watch cable news. But I'm guessing that when Congress back in 2021 and 22 had a committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol, I feel very comfortable in saying Fox News did not cover that very much, because it's not something that their viewers wanted to see. And therein lies, and on the left side, maybe you use MSNBC and some of their hosts, Lawrence O'Donnell, Rachel Maddow, some of their evening hosts. My guess is if they're going to do investigative journalism, it's not going to be on Joe Biden, because their viewership generally thinks well of Biden, or at least they think better of him than they do of Donald Trump, and they don't want to hear it. They want to hear the misdeeds of Donald Trump. So there is some aspect of the watchdog role that can be compromised by the fact that you're still catering to a clientele. You're still catering to an audience. If, to use an analogy, if you are a popular band from decades past, and you're having a reunion concert or you're having a tour, to play the hits. That's what people who are going to your concert want to see. I say this with the Rolling Stones just having rolled through Los Angeles last week. Okay, you're going to play Jumpin' Jack Flash. You're going to play Sympathy for the Devil, right? You're not going to dig too deep into some B-side track off of, Steel Wheels, for God's sake. You're going to play what people know, what people came to see. Well, media outlets are no different. Fox News knows what their viewers are tuning in to see. So are they going to use their watchdog role to hold people accountable that their audience likes? Probably not as much. Why? Because they don't want to disrespect their audience. And that leads us to the concept of bias. So probably the most primary criticism in the news media is the subject of bias. And we'll get to biases in a more particular fashion in a minute. But let's fold them in a little bit here to criticisms of the news media. And the biggest one is the one right at the top of the list, which is a fairly recent phenomenon. if you go back 30 years, 35 years, you had three news outlets: ABC, CBS, NBC. CNN had just begun. There was no MSNBC. There was no Fox News. There was no internet. So you had your local newspaper, LA Times or the Daily Breeze or what have you, and you had news radio stations like KNX here in Los Angeles was. And you had the three major networks. So since they had to broadcast their information to a ideologically dispersed audience, they were somewhat limited in the amount of catering to their clientele they could do because their clientele was so broad, right? Well, one of the things that happens with cable news and then later with the internet is it allows the media to become decentralized. It also allows the media to become narrowcasted. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is you have Fox News, who comes into being in 1996. That's a young network, so to speak. It's only been around about 30 years, less than 30 years, as I speak today. Lord knows how long this recording will exist. But Fox News was founded by a former Republican political operative named Roger Ailes. He was the news director. It was actually founded by Rupert Murdoch, of course, the media magnate. But he hires as his news director Roger Ailes, who is a former Republican political operative, to present what effectively was a conservative news channel. And it was, and the liberals are going to hate me saying this, it was immensely successful. Okay? Very quickly, it was immensely successful. Because the thing that made watching or reading watching the news or reading a newspaper difficult for people prior to that is your priors, what you want to think, what you want to believe was constantly being challenged. Okay? Because you could turn on CBS News if you were a big Reagan fan in the 80s, and some days you'd see fawning coverage of Ronald Reagan. If you were a liberal, you hated that. And some days you'd see criticism of Ronald Reagan. If you were a conservative, you hated that. Well, now here comes Fox News, and Fox News caters those three roles we just discussed. Their gatekeeper role, their scorekeeper role, to an extent, and I'll get to that in a minute, and especially their watchdog role to their audience. And that builds up a tremendous amount of loyalty. Tremendous amount of loyalty. At the end of the day, the people who watch Fox News, generally speaking, and their survey data to support this, don't watch much of anything else. And so once that proves to be successful, which happens very quickly, within 5 years, left-leaning media outlets have been trying for the next 25 years or 20 years to try to mimic it, with, outside of the internet, limited success. Some success on the internet. Some. When you look at sites like Talking Points Memo and Daily Kos and websites of that description. And as we've gotten into the streaming realm, you do have streamers with particular political agendas, left and right. So these roles that we talked about have been compromised a little bit because now a lot of your media outlets are trying to serve a clear audience. So obviously the watchdog role, just to use that as an example, is sort of to be done completely right. It needs to be without fear nor favor, right? You need to, if you're going to be a watchdog, if you're going to be someone who's going to speak truth to power and to investigate misdeeds by government, you have to be willing to investigate them, whether the misdeeds are done by a Democrat or misdeeds are done by a Republican. And because now we are catering to audiences, that's no longer necessarily the case. I'll give you an example. And this does involve Fox News. It's from 2021. One of the things that came out of the 2020 election, and there was a lawsuit, and I don't, at the moment, it's fairly early in the morning, I don't remember the exact genesis of what the lawsuit was, but it required some depositions of folks who worked at Fox News. And this to me is amazing. And you, unless you're a big political geek, and if you are, God bless you, you probably don't know this happened. But Fox News actually did something very surprising on election night, which is they were the first state, or the first state, excuse me, the first outlet, first media outlet that called the state of Arizona for Joe Biden. They did it literally days before anybody else. They did it on election night. And that was huge because Arizona was a tight swing state. It was considered a bit of a bellwether. Whoever would win that would likely win Georgia. And on a night that, for those who don't remember, Donald Trump was doing way better than anyone thought he was going to do. A lot of people thought it was not going to be a particularly close election. Turned out to be a bit of a cliffhanger. This was huge news and deeply upsetting to conservative audiences, to say the least. Well, the details that emerge after the fact is that the news director for Fox News, or one of the news directors, went to their decision desk. So again, peek behind the curtain, guys, because I've actually done this work a little bit. On any election night, there is some nerd, that's how you know I was one point in my life involved in it, who is looking over the election data county by county, state by state, and determining if they can say, look, not all the votes have been counted, but we know so-and-so is going to win this election. So, for example, to take a recent election, when Gavin Newsom ran for re-election as governor back in 2022, when the first early votes were tallied, and he had something like a 22-point lead. Look, it doesn't mean he's going to win by 22, and he didn't. He won by 18, but you could feel very comfortable saying, look, if more than half the vote is in and the dude's up 22, he's going to win. So every news outlet has a decision desk, and it was the decision desk. It was these nerds with computers, God bless them, that determined that they thought that Joe Biden would eventually win the state of Arizona, which, by the way, he did. This news director comes flying in to the decision desk and just tears them a new one, just is screaming at them. And what she said that's interesting, and goes to this idea of ideological bents compromising the roles the news media has historically held, is she didn't say you're calling this too early. The early vote leans to the left, which is true, by the way. It's called a blue mirage. Look for it on election nights. In a lot of states, because they count the early votes, the mail votes early, and mail vote tends to be more left-leaning in the last 4 or 5 election cycles. It can look very early on like the Democrats are doing very well. For example, they'll be up like 20 or 30 in Pennsylvania. It's not how it'll end up. That's a lot of early vote in places like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Could have said that, and that would have been justifiable. Hey, all we've seen is early vote in Arizona. We don't know who's going to win yet. She didn't say that. She said, and I quote, "That's not what our audience wants to hear." And that is concerning. Are you going to tell your audience that Trump didn't lose if he loses? Is that what you're saying? They don't want to hear this. Our audience doesn't want to hear that. Well, sometimes, if we're dealing with information, sometimes information is not what we want to hear, but it's what is. Okay? I'm a Dodger fan. I don't want to hear that the Dodgers blew 2 games on the 9th inning last 3 days. And right away, the Dodger fans that are listening to this are like, oh, I remember that, July 13th and 14th, whatever. I might not want to hear that, but that's what happened, right? So that's the danger of this more ideological news media that we've seen develop. Are you going to give people the information they need? Are you going to give people accurate information? Or are you going to say that's not what our audience wants to hear? Second criticism is that media outlets are at heart of business. So are they going to engage in actual information, or are they going to traffic in clickbait, right? That's a phrase that has come into our vocabulary in the last 10 to 15 years, clickbait. The idea that you put information and frame it in a way that has very little information value, but will get people to access your site and you can sell advertising and whatnot, right? Number 3, the overuse of the scorekeeper role can reduce voter turnout. We saw a real-life example of this in 1996. In 1996, poll after poll after poll showed that Bill Clinton was going to get reelected over Senator Bob Dole very easily. Most polls had it being a 12, a 15, in some cases even a 20-point lead. Two things happened. One, it's a lot closer than the polls indicated. It only wound up being 8 points. And two, it was the lowest modern turnout for an election in history. And a lot of political scientists argue, not all of them, I grant you, but a lot of them argue, well, the reason why turnout sucked is because Republicans are watching the news coverage going, I'm not going to go. My guy can't win. That was some of it, but the bigger part was a lot of Democrats watch news coverage and go, I don't need to go vote. My guy can't lose. And there is some evidence to show that's exactly what happened. If you look at turnout data by county, the more left-leaning counties had worse turnout because it was presumed that the election was over and Clinton would win, which, he did wind up winning, although by less than most people anticipated. But the big thing is, okay, how'd that affect Congress? How'd that affect state legislatures? Where races were considerably closer, and Democrats honestly thought they could reclaim Congress. They wound up not reclaiming Congress. So the scorekeeper role can reduce voter turnout by making people think, oh, this race isn't close or this race isn't going to matter or what have you. Number 4, an overly ambitious use of the watchdog role could lead to increased lack of trust in government. Not everything is Watergate. And so by focusing intently on scandals, often minor scandals, it leads to a inflated opinion of the lack of ethics of all government across the board. Just to give an example, and there are plenty that do exist, when you look at some of the investigations of members of Congress that get blown up, they sold their stock. Okay, but by broadcasting that as a story, you are prescribing to that a motive that might not exist. So and so bought stock in healthcare companies right before the COVID crisis, and they're in Congress. They must have known it. Guys, there were stories, and you guys probably don't remember this. Y'all were, in earlier grades, but there were stories about the COVID outbreak in China dating back to the end of 2019. That's why it's called COVID-19. Because it originally came to the attention of world health officials in 2019. That's where the name comes from. So you didn't need to be corrupt to be like, hey, Zoom might be making a lot of money here later on down the line, or, hey, maybe I'd invest in some pharmaceutical stocks. But by broadcasting that and by, blasting this person's name and, they bought stock in this in January like it's something nefarious, you're presuming corruption where it quite frankly may not exist. That's just one example. Certainly there are others. All right, final slide. So let's look at the two most common complained about biases. Political bias. So political bias is the complaint that the press pulls for one side over another. Oh, the press is a liberal bias, the press has a conservative bias. Now, if you're talking about historically speaking, not in the last 25 years, but prior to that, a lot of those bias claims were what we call bias of perception. Look, if I am a big fan of the Dodgers, I'm not going to like an umpire calling a third strike on Freddie Freeman. And I'm going to say that's a terrible call. Or if I'm a big football fan and they call back a Kansas City Chiefs touchdown for holding, I'm pretty pissed off about that, right? But it doesn't mean that the call was wrong. It just means that I think it was wrong because I want it to be wrong. That's what we mean by biases of perception. If I am very left-leaning politically, then I'm probably going to be more inclined to think that the press is too conservative. Why? Because they're more conservative than I am. Likewise, if I'm very conservative, I'm going to say that the press is liberally biased because they're more liberal than I am, right? It's no different if you go to any sporting event, right? No one ever walks out saying, hey, refs did a really good job, we just suck, right? That never happens. And if you play a sport, same thing. You've never said, oh, man, the refs really did us a solid today because they were really on our side today. That never happens, right? It's a time-honored tradition to complain about officiating in all of sports ball. Well, politics is no different. If you are of a conservative persuasion, you're going to think the press is always against your side, because you're going to, first of all, they're going to probably give you information you don't want to hear, and that makes you mad. And second of all, at the end of the day, you're going to be more hyper focused on the stuff you don't want to hear. We're 3 times as likely to remember negative information, or what we perceive to be negative information, as we are positive information. It's an actual study, by the way. I didn't pull that number out of my rear end. So that's what we mean by biases of perception. Okay? But the truth is, with the rise of targeted media, political bias in some outlets is freely admitted. One of the leading liberal websites, the Daily Kos, the author, Marcos Malitzis, when he founded the site 20-something years ago, he said in the very first post he posted, "I am a Democrat. This site exists to promote and elect Democrats. I make no apologies for that." I mean, he just laid it right out. This is a site that will have a left-leaning bias, And certainly as media has become more decentralized with the internet, with cable, with streaming and YouTube and all this other stuff, that's become even more true, right? Now, the danger in that, and it is a danger, is because we have this situation where information has become so decentralized, we're now in a media environment where you can tailor your consumption so that you never hear anything other than what you want to hear. That was not always the case. So if I'm growing up back in the 80s, which I did, when I open the LA Times, if I'm a liberal, I'm going to read things from time to time on the front page I don't want to hear. I don't want to hear nice things said about Republican Governor George Deukmejian. Ask your grandparents or your parents if they're older. I don't want to hear criticism of the mayor of LA, who was a Democrat at the time, Tom Bradley. The international terminal at LAX is named after him, right? But now I don't have to worry about that, because I can just go to this website. I can just listen to this TikToker or YouTuber who's politically very well established. I can just, if I'm a conservative, watch Fox News. If I'm a liberal, maybe I'm watching MSNBC. And so I never have to hear the things I don't want to hear. And that's dangerous. I mean, potentially it's really dangerous. Because if people are willing to manipulate that information in a negative way, then at the end of the day, you could have people not just, badly misinformed, but dangerously so, where they start to think, crazy shit, right? Because there are no gatekeepers anymore. If someone can go viral, they could have no basis in information at all, and they can spout quote-unquote information that is completely false, and millions of people will watch it, or hundreds of thousands of people will watch it. That is dangerous. The second bias is discussed a great deal less, but it's still incredibly important, and that is commercial bias. It's probably more common than political bias in the classic sense that it permeates everything that media outlets do, okay? And that is because, and this goes back to something I said in the previous slide, the news media is a business. Its objective is to make money. And so are they going to tailor how they present news to ensure that people will watch, that people will read, that people will subscribe? Okay? I'm not going to name names because I don't want to, sound like I'm trafficking in sour grapes or dirty laundry. But someone I know, at least tangentially, used to be a really good, kind of in the scorekeeper role, a really good elections analyst. And he had a mainstream gig with a major network, and that fell through eventually because of budget cuts. So he turned to something called Substack. Now, for those who don't know, Substack is a subscription service. You get people to read your stuff, and rather than, subscribing like you would to a newspaper or having to watch a bunch of advertising, you pay X number of dollars a month and you have access to their articles, right? And it was impossible not to notice that when he went to Substack, he became considerably more sensationalistic in his writing and also considerably more conservative. Um, to the point that he repudiated arguments and analysis that he had made in the past um, in this new realm on Substack. And it became pretty clear pretty quick that what he was doing was chasing the money. That he saw a niche, that for what the kind of analysis he does, there weren't a lot of people on the political right, and he was hunting Substack subscriptions. So he completely changed his style of analysis. He completely changed his ideological approach, which was center to left of center to being very right of center, because he was trying to sell subscriptions. It was like almost like he assumed a character. Kind of hard to watch, to be honest with you. But why did he do that? Because he needed to make money. There's your sponsor bias, if you call it. The viewers are your sponsor. So now you're going to tell, it goes back to what we were just talking about with political bias. Now you're going to tell them nothing but they want to hear. You're going to play nothing but the hits because they're the ones that pay the bills. The other bias is what's called the edutainment bias. And that is a tendency to focus on political coverage that is less meaningful, but perhaps more entertaining. The famous example of this was there was like a 3-day story in the news media back when President Obama was in office about him wearing a tan suit. And what the implications was, how could a president be so casual? This was like, the press covered it like it was an impeachable offense. It was a tan freaking suit. Because it got into this like really entertaining fashion debate, right? Celebrity weddings, political celebrity weddings, or who they're dating, or God knows what else. So you start to get things that are not really news, but they're entertaining. Plus, it goes out to the edutainment guys' bias goes beyond the realm of political news. It goes back to the gatekeeper role that we talked about earlier, in that hard, important political news gets pushed off of the newspaper, gets pushed off of the TV broadcast for fluffier entertainment stuff. It's like, yeah, this major peace accord is being negotiated, but hey, Travis Kelce went to Taylor Swift's concert in Dublin. Let's focus on that. And I say that as someone who's a Kansas City Chiefs fan and a Travis Kelce fan. Love his podcast, but it's not news. Now, it ensures that every Swiftie might watch your news broadcast, hoping that there'll be footage of it, but again, that's not news. But it might draw a few more eyes, which means your ratings might be a little bit better, which means you could charge a little bit more for advertising, and now we're off to the races. That's commercial bias. So there you go. That is the news media in a very quick 39-minute nutshell. Have a great day. Take good care of yourselves and others, and I'll see you next time.